Some of you may know that Adam Tooze, besides all the other things he does, is also a prolific newsletter writer. His newsletter is called Chartbook, and it contains, well, lots of charts. And that gave us the idea for this next session, 3 short conversations chaired by Adam, each based on a chart. The conversations will focus broadly on 3 topics: aging, resources, and the AI race, but there's plenty of room to take them into unexpected directions. For the first conversation, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage, again, Yumiko Murakami, and of course, Adam Tooze. And the conversation is based on this chart, which shows how extraordinary for world population growth the 20th century was.
Pretty drastic one.
We like drastic charts.
Yeah.
Please, come on up.
Sure, thank you. Did you pick this chart?
This is a good chart.
Yeah.
And I cannot claim credit for having picked it, but it is on the minds of a modern historian, of a modern economic historian, because this really is a world-defining chart. See how far back it goes, to 1700. So we're really in the world of the early modern period, or just coming out of it. And then we have this world-defining break, really as late as the 1950s. Where global mortality comes down more rapidly than fertility comes down. And that's what produces the surge. So there is an early increase in fertility, but above all, this is a graph about mortality, because mortality comes down. And now we're in a world in which it's fertility that's doing most of the dynamic regulation, because fertility has plunged. But as a analyst of Japan, of a reader of the Japanese situation, how does this graph strike you?
Well, as Japan is leading this trend,
yeah.
It is the fastest aging society in the world, although the trend has been taking place in many other countries, but in terms of how drastic and how fast this trend is sort of shaping the economy, shaping the society, Japan is really the cutting edge, so to speak. So we've been talking about this in different sessions. It's in Japan already happening. It's part of the daily reality. It's something that you will see, you feel every day. And for those who have been to Japan, it may not be all that visible when you are in Tokyo. It's extremely visible if you leave Tokyo and then travel to smaller towns outside Tokyo, just literally 2 hours, in terms of how this demographic trend is already changing the scenery. You know, you see, we were talking about this in an earlier session, you see empty houses, you see abandoned buildings, because we just don't have enough people to occupy them. So it's the reality of the Japanese society today. It is changing the way we work, we live, and it is changing the way the society is the community and economy is run.
I mean, I love the way you're putting it so neutrally, because I guess the question on everyone's mind in this room, being a very pragmatic kind of a group, is this a problem?
Yep.
Because one way of looking at an abandoned house in the countryside is that looks like a fantastic holiday home.
Yeah.
After all, that is what happened to a large part of the European countryside in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, is that folks moved. Italy, in 1945, had a population that was 40% rural. By the 1980s, it's an overwhelmingly urban society. And what came out of that was the holiday culture of upper middle class Europeans in Tuscany. Is this perceived as a crisis, as a problem, or is it something that's happening?
It's definitely seen as a major economic and social challenge. It's a huge challenge. But, you know, one thing that has come up in earlier conversations, which may be a little bit of a surprise, is that there is definitely upside. There is definitely a very interesting situation where we are starting to see interesting business opportunities, silver economy.
Yes.
But something that we really haven't talked about too much. But in Japan, we are already seeing how this aging society is creating new markets. And it's something that will be seen in many other countries as well, but it's really not that obvious in other countries because it's not hitting in other countries' societies or economies in a way it has hit Japan. So I would say there are definitely both sides, and quite frankly, this demographic challenge, seen as a challenge, is the way most of us will look at this situation. I do believe that there are both sides, and it's important for us to be able to see the upside as well. Also, another thing that I think we have to think about is more consumption, the better economy. That's how we look at the world, right? But that's how the economy grows, right? You have more people, you have more consumption. People consume more, that's how the economy grows. Is that a good thing?
But I mean, old people presumably are the big spenders because it's now or never. So there's no benefit in saving if you're an elderly person. You dissave. So you would expect the savings rate of the elderly to decline. I mean, obviously they may want to leave some assets to their descendants. I mean, I thought that was where you were going to head, that the silver economy is really as an age-led consumption economy, starting with healthcare, but then a whole variety of other services, presumably.
I think that's true, but the way people consume as they get older, it might be different.
Yes.
It may be very different from the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Yes.
They may not be buying big houses. They may not be buying new cars, right? Where do they spend money on?
Yeah.
It could be more, service-driven, things like, for example, they may be willing to spend more money to improve their quality of life by maybe, experience, maybe travel, maybe, digital services that may be costing them more, but they may be willing to do so. And I do think it's the kind of sort of spiritual experience that older people are willing to pay a lot of money for that you may not see in the 20s and 30s. So this is something that is really, it's a new phenomenon, and I don't think any other societies have experienced it. So it's sort of experimental in many ways for Japan as well. So I think it's interesting how the spending pattern you see with Asian society is not the same as what you have been seeing in many other economies. And I do think that's where interesting economic opportunities can come from.
I mean, I love the non-judgmental way in which we're looking at this, but it seems it would be wrong, I think, to avoid the question of why is this happening? Like, what is the prevalent view in Japan of why the birth rate has fallen as much as it has? I mean, setting aside the normative judgment about people should have children, women should have children, like what is the prevalent explanation for why they aren't?
Does it make economic sense for families to have more children?
That the economics is the core of it.
That's one very important question.
Right.
And quite frankly, the answer to many families has been no in the last, at least in the last 20 years.
Help us think through what are the components of that difficult choice.
The cost of having kids.
And that is childcare.
Opportunity cost.
Opportunity cost.
Especially for women, unfortunately, in the Japanese society. So if you think about the opportunity cost of having kids, cost of having family relative to other opportunities, the answer, unfortunately, has been not very encouraging in terms of people choosing to have.
And the opportunity cost is as high as it is because the assumption is that women will stay at home and be principally mothers, or because childcare is very expensive? Again, I want to kind of keep digging down into what why is the opportunity cost as high as it is?
So again, if you look at the history, as people get more educated, especially women, it's unfortunately the situation we're seeing in many countries, including Japan. Women are choosing careers over having children. And we're talking about this earlier, having children can cost women a lot more than it can cost men for a lot of different societal and economical reasons. Yeah. And that has to change, and the government has realized in Japan, these are the things that policymakers really have to work on, because if you have a choice, as an educated woman, you have a choice between pursuing a professional life And you have a choice between sort of balancing family life and career. And quite frankly, the second, in terms of having both, is not easy.
Yeah. This is the result also of research on the American case, in that as discrimination in the workplace against women has diminished, it has exposed more and more clearly the impact of child rearing on women's biographies.
Exactly, yeah.
So as opportunities in the workplace have actually become levelized, the impact of child rearing has become more and more like crystallized as the central. I mean, does that not suggest then that that's an area where policy, both business and the public sector, should be thinking harder about simply changing the terms of that trade-off?
Yeah, so when I was at OECD, we looked at different countries' policies in terms of supporting families and especially working women. And the countries that have done relatively well, the Scandinavian countries.
The Nordics,
yeah. And they're the ones who actually have focused both on the fathers and mothers.
Yes.
And a very balanced approach in terms of supporting families on both sides of the equation. And I think that's something that Japan has to do better of, maybe other countries too, because they're having a lot of initiatives and programs to support working women, working mothers, but not so much on the father side.
Yes.
And I think that's a missing link. I do believe that unless you can actually change the mindset of the father along with the mother, you can't really move the needle. And I think that's something that I would love to see the Japanese government to work on. And quite frankly, I think maybe Korea the same way, and maybe in China the same way. Well, maybe not so much China, because Chinese women tend to be a little bit more, advanced in the society. But I do believe that's one important policy improvement that I think could potentially make a very good impact on.
Because it signals a kind of the idea that this is really a holistic problem. It's for the couple and not simply for the woman to resolve the trade-off. I think that's a very powerful idea. I mean, the other way of thinking about this issue, presumably, is this is a chart here, not for Japan, this is a chart for the world. And after all, where does it top out? I can't quite read my Alicia to world. 10.43 billion. So we're not short of people. We have more people than ever before. So another obvious approach is an international one, and it's been raised, Dr. Kang mentioned it earlier on, which is migration. I mean, how, again, using Japan as a case to think with, because as you say, it's a sort of spaceship experiment of aging. What do you judge Dr. Kang sounded quite optimistic as a not now, but in the longer run. How do you judge the prospects of a migration-based redistribution? So solving the problem at the global level, that is the balance between the countryside and the city.
Yeah, so I wasn't, I was half kidding, but I wasn't really kidding when I said earlier in the earlier session, we should import Indian, workers to Japan, because we have completely opposite issues. But if we work together, between Japan and India, we could potentially address this issue, right? And so I do think the immigration policy that we've been talking about can be a big part of the solution. I do believe also there has to be very carefully thought out policies which would support successful immigration solution. And those policies would include skilling and reskilling considerations. So we need to think about the people who would come to Japan who can be well supported in terms of their skill training. We have a very large program to sponsor workers from the Philippines and Indonesia and Vietnam to Japan. And we call this program trainee program. Okay, so the reason is because we do believe these are the people who can be trained in the Japanese economy, and these are the people who are supposedly, after being trained in Japan, in the different segments of the economy, they will go back to their countries and they become, good building, supporters of their societies, their economies. And I think that program actually is a very good one. But I think the other element that needs to be considered is that enough for Japan? We have this trainee program. We bring these people, train them, and then bring back. Probably not, right? So the other element that needs to be considered is these are the people who could potentially stay in Japan and become more permanent elements of the Japanese society. And that part, we have not figured that out yet. So in terms of skilling, reskilling, and of course, not everyone is going to stay in Japan. But I do believe the country, the government has to think about who are the people who should stay in Japan on a long-term basis and become a much more lasting and permanent solution of the society. That, I don't think Japanese government has gone far enough. And I do believe that's where the Japanese government has to go in terms of their immigration policy next.
There's a very profound challenge for societies, which Switzerland can tell a story about, Germany as well, as how relatively homogenous societies begin to imagine themselves as societies of large-scale permanent migration. I mean, that is a profound political and cultural shift that, as we see from recent political reactions across Europe and also now in the United States, is very, very difficult to digest and will no doubt pose enormous problems also in the Asian sphere. Unfortunately, our time is up. Being a good team player, I think we should wrap at this point and then come back for questions to the whole group at the end of today's proceedings. Thank you so much for that fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much. And we're just going to pass it right along. Thank you very much, Yumiko, Murakami. Adam's going to stay on stage, of course, and I'm pleased to welcome back Dewi, Fortuna, Anwar to the stage for a conversation on resources and industrial policy. That chart might require some explanation and maybe some binoculars to read it. We can send it to you afterwards if you want. The interesting thing here is that it's a chart that shows for both advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies, the reasons or the motives for trades distorting industrial policies. And just in case you can't see, so the blue one is strategic competitiveness, which is much higher on the emerging market side. Climate change mitigation, of course, much higher on the advanced economy side. And there's also a huge chunk that's just called other. So there's plenty of reasons to distort trade. And I guess that's sort of the starting point of that conversation. Enjoy.
Thank you, Nico. Welcome, Dewi. I quite like this role of sitting here talking to fascinating people about data. We thought we would, we coordinated a little bit ahead of time. In a panel I was involved in at lunchtime, this topic came up. Indonesia. Fascinating policy with regard to international business. And the story that made the headlines in the Western media that I track was that the Indonesian government had decided to limit the importation of Apple and Google cell phones to Indonesia on grounds of local content ruling. And I'd love to hear more about the rationale for that policy and its broader context, because it's a very, very interesting story about Indonesian industrial policy and the resource dimension of that.
Yeah, I'm here in the false color because I'm not an economist, you know. My knowledge is probably less than many people in the audience here. But you know, Indonesia has followed various industrial policies. Yeah. But one of the policies in 2017, the previous government, Joko Widodo government, passed a law. It's a very strict law about the imports of certain goods that they have to be local contents. Yeah. So, you know, Apple is supposed to invest an amount of money, I think it's 1.7 billion or something like that, to invest in, you know, to create jobs in Indonesia. And apparently it's a bit short of that. He said, you know, I don't really get the figure. It's at $1.5 million or something. You know, it's not that much, yes. But it has to do it. Yes. And because it falls short, Indonesia has banned the import of Apple 16. Is that yeah? But apparently, you know, if Apple meets that requirement, then it will be able to sell. Yeah. But you know, this is quite vigorously imposed by the current government. If you notice that a number of the cabinet ministers in Prabowo's governments are carryover from the Jokowi government. So this is not a new policy. This is a policy that's been there before. This is not just against Western imports. Samsung has built factory in Indonesia. You can't import cars. You cannot import Mercedes-Benz or Honda or Toyota to Indonesia fully built up. You always have to have factories built in Indonesia. They have some parts of the manufacturing have to be done in the country. And that's been ongoing since the New Order government, actually. Indonesia also is very strict about
the which government? The
New Order government under Suharto.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so it has been like that. So you cannot bring a brand new Mercedes from Germany to Indonesia. They're actually local manufacturing. At least the bodies and the fabrications, are locally made. So it's been a long-term policy. In the beginning, it's import substitution, put it that way. But now it's to create more jobs and a bit of value added for Indonesia. And maybe it didn't make so much news in the West, but Indonesia banned the e-commerce platform on TikTok. TikTok is awfully popular, but they used to sell directly from their own platform. That's banned in Indonesia because that's considered to be killing competition. So TikTok has invested in a local e-commerce platform called Tokopedia. So it's working quite well for them. And then now Indonesia has also banned another e-commerce platform to China called Temu, which wants to sell directly from Chinese factories. This is China trying to resolve its oversupply by selling directly to us. Indonesia has banned that completely. So we are quite non-aligned or multi-aligned here. The policies affect everybody.
Yes. And nickel also, I think, right? There was a requirement.
Indonesia has banned the exports of raw materials.
Raw materials.
So all raw materials have, their blanket ban. Indonesia is not allowed to export, whether it's wood, rattan, or nickels, or other raw materials, because we want to move away from this colonial types of economy where Indonesia would produce raw materials and export it cheaply to Japan or South Korea or to Europe and then buy them back at a higher price. This where the value added is enjoyed by other countries. So Indonesia wants to move up, so it's banned the raw materials exports, and nickel is one of them. And of course, the EU has taken Indonesia to WTO. We lost at the WTO, but luckily there's no judge in the Court of Appeal, so Indonesia has continued to enjoy this
Thanks to the Americans.
Thanks to the American, it's unlikely to have a Court of Appeal soon.
Yeah.
So, but this is Indonesia. This is not just government policy. This is something that the public also supports. The Indonesia really needs to grow and move up the economic ladder and develop, at least a certain amount of value added within the country.
And there's an element of necessity there, right? Poverty initially, or the need to develop, shall we say, less pejoratively, the size of the population that requires employment.
Yes.
But I guess when we've got resources here as our title, I guess the question one might ask is what are the bases on which Indonesia exerts this muscle? Because it's quite an assertive policy at one level, right? I mean, it's like the Europeans take offense and go, what on earth are you doing? You're breaching all sorts of rules.
I know. I mean, but when you say that, we don't want to continue the VOC policy, the Netherlands is in these policies of exploiting and just extracting all the goods from the Indonesia and then taking it away and then keeping us, at the lower level. There is this ambition to have more control over resources. And Prabowo is going to be even more ambitious, this started from President Habibie when he was Minister of Research and Technology. He famously said, look at this steel, iron, this block of irons. If you just sell it like this, it probably costs about $10 per kilos. Yeah. You sell it to Germany and you buy a Mercedes, how much is a Mercedes per kilo? This is the, he's been trying to do this, trying to say to Indonesians, don't just say we are rich in natural resources, but we are very poor in human capital development. You need to have education, innovation, research, science, and technology, so that we can actually enjoy, the wealth instead of other countries enjoying this, and while we will be kept at a lower level.
Yeah.
So this has been ongoing since the New Order government, but we were lulled by our natural resources, and now it's only now that there is this realization. If we do not shift, if we don't invest more. Instead of talking about just comparative advantage, it's like we need to talk about competitive advantages. There should be an element of innovation, science and technology to escape from the middle income trap.
Yeah.
So now even economists who used to criticize Habibienomics, they called it, there used to be this Berkeley mafia who talk about comparative advantage and that Indonesia should not go into this industrial policy because it's not competitive, etc., etc. Yeah. But now they're all talking the same language, a bit late. They're looking at the Korean model in a way, So Korea is really cited very much as a model that Indonesia should emulate, where more investment on human development and innovation.
Yes. It goes back to the point we were talking about this morning, Zishen's point about the way in which it's politics everywhere and all the time, right? Because the interpretation that we put on the economic success stories and failures is very model dependent. And as you're saying, in the case of Chile, notoriously, it's the Chicago school economists who provide the narrative. And as you're pointing out, it's another school of American economists who describe a development path for Indonesia, which is hugely contentious and now has been relativized by the success of the East Asian success stories, which were driven very much by that, 8 billion T-shirts for a 747 plane or something like that, which is, the Chinese version of the trade-off you're talking about. The politics here is irreducible. I guess from the European point of view, though, and it comes out of this graph, if we go back to it, there is a really interesting difference, isn't there, between the pie chart for the advanced economies and the pie chart for the emerging economies, and it's the difference around the green element. How would you see green thinking, environmental thinking, figuring in Indonesia's strategies around its resources, its developmental needs?
Yeah.
Is it something imported from the outside, from Europe, irritatingly foisted on you by deforestation regulations or nuisance stuff like that?
Yes and no. I mean, Indonesia, like any other developing countries, sometimes, you have to think about sustainable development as well.
Yeah, because you're a carbon bomb. If you deforest, it's disastrous.
So just cutting down our forests, which can cause flooding, landslides, it's not in our best interest either. Yeah. But at the same time, banning all, what the EU is trying to ban and to scrutinize this forest regulation and so on, it's problematic for countries like Indonesia, where, our foreign exchange reserves depend a lot on our exports of palm oil and rubber and so on. So if you look at Europe, Indonesia has very good relations with individual EU members, but when it comes to EU, the relationship has been a bit contentious. There is a perception in Indonesia that a lot of the EU regulations, which are supposed to protect the environment, is in fact protectionist in measures. And it's about oil. Palm oil is to protect the European-owned, vegetable oils and so on. But you should be careful also if it's protesting too much about palm oil. It might not get any very soon, because President Prabowo has talked a lot about food self-sufficiency, energy self-sufficiency, and a lot of this energy is going to come from biofuel. And that means that, a lot of Indonesian-owned palm oil would be used internally, domestically, for biofuel. So maybe there will be less available for the market. So that's another concern that you need to pay attention. But there is this perception that a lot of the environmental issues that are being brought by Europe is less about environmental protection; it's more about protectionist measures to protect their own market.
I'm very struck in this conversation by the echoes of history, and I guess I wonder, as a kind of concluding question, how you see and judge the current moment in Indonesia's development against the legacy of non-alignment, Indonesia's developmental ambitions of the past. I mean, there is talk in the global political economy community of a new era of non-alignment, of a new Bandung, of a new vision of an autonomous, a set of coalition of autonomous Asian players asserting themselves. The way that you're giving the story, the narrative that you're giving us of Indonesian economic policy now would seem like a quite self-conscious revival of that ambition.
Well, there is a conscious revival, but as I say, it's not about, in the past, I say non-alignment was based on a sense of vulnerability. When you have these two blocks and you do not want to be pulled from one to the other, and you say, basically leave us alone.
Intense violence results from the struggle within Indonesia.
Yeah, because when you talk about the Cold War, in Southeast Asia, it's not cold. They have the Vietnam War, so hot war. So, so Indonesia say, we do not want to be pulled to one side or the other. We do not want to be sucked into a war, not of our own making. So Indonesia is very strict about that. It doesn't enter into any military alliances. It's illegal for Indonesian soldiers to fight in another land. Indonesian soldiers can only serve overseas under the blue beret, under the UN. Now, non-alignment, it's about multi-engagements. It's much more self-confident iteration of it, put it that way. So Indonesia, like India, like many other countries in the global south now, want to have our cake and eat it. China is there. There's a lot of challenges from China, but there's a lot of opportunities, and we want to have benefits from that. But the West is there. It's our traditional trading partners, the source of technology, and where a lot of young people still want to go to have their education. Europe and the United States and so on. So why would you cut off that connection? So we want to continue to engage with that. But there are also other emerging economies. When you face protectionism in EU or in North America, then you need to find somewhere else. So you go to Africa. Everybody wants to go to Africa now, and also to Latin America. There's closer connections with Latin America as well. So in this sense, there's opportunities. You want to engage with everyone, and not to be dominated by anyone. And then the continuing narrative for Indonesia is that we do not want to accept regional hegemony, and there's basic suspicions of all great powers. At the end of the day, great powers only look after their own interests. They regard other countries as collateral. So, in ensuring strategic autonomy and your own agency remains critical. So that is the carryover from the Bandung spirit.
Thank you very much. After such a fascinating insight on Japan, now another one on Indonesia. This is a great format. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And who do we have next? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dewi. That was fascinating. Before we move on to the third and final of those conversations, and by the way, internally this format was called the Tooze Hot Seat, which I quite like. I want to remind you that it's almost time for our second block of questions and answers. So if you haven't submitted your question yet, you can do so through Slido. But I also want to tell you that for the second block, we are going to take a few questions live. We have microphones in the room, so you can also just think of a question, keep it in your mind, and then we'll sort of alternate between Slido and questions from the room. But before we do so, I'm happy to welcome back to the stage for the final conversation with Adam, Alicia García Herrero. The chart for this conversation shows economies with 3 or more top 100 science and technology clusters. So this conversation is going to go into the direction of science and technology and its connection to economic development. And it may or may not be about overcapacity as well. We'll see. Enjoy.
Oh, wow, you're bringing a computer. You're coming armed. What have you got in there?
I can't remember the data, so I need to read it out.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Should we talk about overcapacity?
No, I think we need to
Let's just
stick
talk
to,
about
it's up to you,
let's stick to our task here. What do you see when you see that? Do you? I guess the question might be like, do you believe it? Does this data and its apparent message strike you as a plausible view of the world? You're obviously someone who reads data very critically and in great depth.
I actually use WIPO data. exactly what I had here, and that's what I brought it.
So WIPO is?
Well, International Patent Organization. Yeah, so I know this data quite well. Clusters, actually, cluster data is very much dominated by economies of scale. This is why you don't see European European clusters.
Let's just spell that out for a second. So, what do we mean by cluster data? Why is it dominated by scale?
This is science and technology clusters. So basically, these are big conglomerates of science and technology companies or research institutes.
Right. So Silicon Valley or
exactly. So it is quite important to have the economy of scale to create that cluster. If you look at individual companies, the picture would be a little bit different. It would be mostly the US. So, and especially because, since 2022, China has lost a little bit of that shine on companies in science and technology space. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that the clusters look bigger for China than they would look company-wise.
Right, and so let's break this down. So first of all, so what you're saying is the Chinese tech ecosystem is more cluster-based, diffuse, lots of smaller gaggles of players, whereas the American one is big units.
Exactly, and there is a reason for that, which is easy to understand, is industrial policy.
Yeah.
So if you look at China's, for example, largest industrial policy venture today is called 10,000 Little Giants.
Yeah.
That is all based on clusters. So, you have companies selected to receive funds, which then need to work on a cluster basis. So the data does show, indeed, that. But that doesn't mean it's not relevant. It is very important because for industrial innovation in the industrial sector, you need the clusters. And because vertical integration is very difficult in a single company. Thus, it is a very good news for China.
Oh, so I was going to follow up. So if we judge this by the scale of companies, we might put America in number one. But as a model of innovation, you actually think this is a better model in
for the industrial sector.
For industrial sector, as opposed to services or
sectors that can be integrated more easily without a big supply chain.
Like financial services.
Services in general, I would say,
But for manufacturing or something like this, this cluster, this regional model of a little bit like once upon a time Emilia-Romagna or Southwest Germany or Switzerland for that matter, where you would have these combinations. So what happened in 22 that took the shine off? Is it the Shanghai story I was telling?
Well, first of all, take Fortune 500.
Yeah.
Fortune 500, before 2022, China had the largest number of Fortune 500, I think 2 or 3 above the US.
This is by market capitalization?
Fortune 500, I think, is assets, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember. But anyway, market capitalization would be very easy to explain because all of these companies, given what happened with China's stock market, lost a lot of capital.
That was my easy out.
But I actually think it's sales, revenue, not assets, it's revenue.
Right, okay.
But again, revenue is important.
Yes.
Latest data, let me give you an idea why it's important. Industrial profits in China.
Yeah.
In August, we don't have, September, we don't have October yet. -27. Yeah. That explains it all. Yeah. It's tough.
Whereas the US economy has been on this extraordinary tear since 21.
So that explains the...
Right. But that's a business evaluation. So, but in terms of, we go back to the tech issue and this generative story, you're, on the basis of this data alone and this basic analysis of clusters as being highly dynamic, you have a relatively optimistic story to tell about China as a manufacturing hub.
Yeah.
And so I guess there are like 2 follow-on questions. I mean, how far can industrial policy actually, in the West, could it possibly affect this? And the second follow-on question would be, what are the odds of any of the European players on this list moving significantly, or any of the other Asian players in this list moving significantly?
Okay, so how important is industrial policy? Let's take the first question.
Yeah.
Again, this is all kinds of science and technology. I think China is dominated by the industrial sector, so let's focus on that. So subsidies in China are very related, so at least industrial policy subsidies, because there's two types, at least according to at least my mindset of subsidies, and I've worked on this quite a lot. There is what I call let's call it usual subsidies, meaning SOEs or, 90% of Chinese companies are subsidized. So barring the general subsidies and focusing on actual industrial policy related subsidies, meaning where companies are chosen, such as Made in China 2025 or these 10,000 Little Giants, those subsidies are much more targeted and they're very much related to innovation. So let me give you the example. Made in China, we can't really tell because we don't have information. I mean, we don't even know which companies were selected. This is not unveiled, and I can't. But 10,000 Little Giants is much more transparent, and we did research on that, and we actually showed in an empirical paper that indeed one of the requirements was for the company to be selected to do more R&D, to be more innovative. And according to our results, an empirical result, yes, they are. So China chooses companies that are more innovative to be targeted, meaning to receive subsidies.
That's how we think industrial subsidies should be done. This is exactly how we should do it.
But it's not the end of the story. So nothing is perfect, not even in China. So the second variable that the government requires the company to do, which makes sense, is that you should be doing what I give you the money for, meaning if you ask for a subsidy in electric vehicles, you should be producing electric vehicles, and supposedly the innovation that you claim you're doing should be related to electric vehicles. Guess what happens? 70% of the companies are doing something else.
Right.
So, this is about...
So they're milking the subsidy system.
And maybe they're great companies. Maybe they move from producing, which is the case, and I'm sure you've read this one, noodles to producing EVs. But, frankly speaking, the fact that, you see what I mean? Like, there is a little bit of a jump on how those companies are chosen.
So let's wind this back. So what I'm trying to get at, if this is the world, and this is one in which China has these big clusters, and as Europeans we're looking at this, or some other Asian player, Indonesia, you're looking at this, like, how, from Chinese experience or other people's experience, could one imagine shifting this? And what odds would you give us? Obviously, at some level, the Germans could turn the Spätzle manufacturer into an EV manufacturer right now. They'd kill for that opportunity. Like, how many German food producers are there that want to be in the EV business? If we could produce that kind of dysfunction, we'd all cheer.
But we've not yet, I have not yet said that all of these companies getting money are successful. So in other words, I'm only saying that they seem to choose companies that are actually more profitable, to end the story, have more R&D, but they don't happen to be doing what we would. That's all we find. But we do not show whether, actually, let me tell you, we do check, because this is important for Europe, whether this industrial policy makes these companies export more, Good question. Because that's what the Commission is all about, Are you exporting more thanks to your subsidies? And guess what we find? Not really. No, they don't.
The Chinese ones don't export more with subsidies?
No, the companies, so basically we compare a company with subsidies, same sector, to a company without subsidies in the same sector. The company with subsidies does not necessarily export more than the one without subsidies. That's what we find. Now, is this a success? It could be a success, which is actually the case, that these companies that are selected are receive a positive signaling effect, from the local government. And in fact, we do find that they do more IPOs, they get more funding, they become bigger. So is this a success? It's hard to tell, you know. Like it depends on what's your objective.
I see we've got less than 5 minutes to go. We've not said AI yet.
Yes, that was
and AI is in our title, so I feel we should definitely talk. We've talked about the race, maybe, but like, what does your extraordinary research tell us about AI as part of this?
I'm trying to read it for you.
Story?
Well, this is to be published.
Wow, you really do come with weapons. Like,
no,
you've got that. Like,
here you go. I can share it with others later. So this is what we found. So what's your question first?
My question is how far. No, my question is how far does AI figure in this story at all? Because you've been emphasising. You know, the suggestion is China has innovation clusters, S&T clusters. AI is the buzzword of the moment. You bring the two things together, and what you want to know is whether these clusters produce AI. And that's my question.
Okay, that's your question. No? Okay, China produce. So first of all, China is, and this is not me telling you, it's Kai-Fu Lee, and he was right, you know. China-US rivalry in AI, this, you know, what is AI superpowers? This book he wrote a little while ago, and he was totally right. Europe was nowhere to be found. In fact, you know, I have Europe in my graph in terms of radical novelties in AI, and it's very, very small. It's all about China and the US. Do the clusters produce AI, your question?
Yes.
According to our research, not really, because the number of companies in China doing all of this AI innovation is very small.
Right.
But you can guess who they are. I mean, they're
the
Huawei is exactly. It's very concentrated.
So in a sense, AI in China is a little bit like AI in the US. Is it's capital intensive?
Yes, totally.
It favors the dominant players. It isn't a cluster story, which is more metal bashing or microelectronics. AI is a big firm business.
Exactly. That's what we find. Baidu is another one. ByteDance. ByteDance is very big. Cloud Minds Robotics. So, you know, you have a few, but there are few companies. Now, of course, these clusters will benefit from that.
They're downstream of the AI innovation which is happening in the big firm.
And I think the beauty of the Chinese model is that probably the benefits or the profits, if you want, of those upstream AI companies will come down because they will have to come down because they're receiving surely enormous subsidies to do this AI story. So, you know, while in the US, maybe, you know, these are companies that will take their own decisions on whether this is passed on to downstream to the manufacturing sector.
It's a crazy idea. If Europe wanted to break into AI at this point, given that it's not a cluster story and you need a champion, does it essentially have to be maybe like a publicly funded AI project? A little bit like
you seem to have read my paper. I might worry.
No, but like the Human Genome Project, that was a European public project. In America, it was private. Yes. Is there an argument for a public champion?
There you go. Look, this is Europe. All of the companies I have, especially quantum, because in quantum, I have to give something positive about Europe before we finish this conversation. On quantum, in some sectors in quantum, we are at par with China and the US.
Yes.
It's unbelievable.
Draghi report shows that too, doesn't it? Yeah.
And it is, in fact, the case, but the difference is the following. Quantum, the company that is dominant in China is, again, Huawei. Yeah. In our cases, they're all public universities. What's the difference? Because we actually look at the diffusion, meaning how easy it is for our radical patents, I mean, to move to China or the US, as opposed to US radical patents moving to Europe or China, or China's radical patents moving to Europe. Ours move faster. Why? Because
no one owns them.
Exactly, because they are university-led. So, you know, it sounds good, but at the same time, it has this problem that we are not commercializing our radical innovation in Europe. So something has to come up with a good idea of how we can keep that innovation. And as you said, getting the clusters out of this basic innovation that isn't as bad, at least for quantum. It is frankly quite bad for semiconductors and AI, according to our research.
Thank you so much. That's an incredibly illuminating one-point policy prescription. That's clearly what Europeans need to set about doing. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.